Good afternoon and welcome to the Law and Crime Trial Network. I'm your host, Brian Buckmire. So we're still going to be covering the pathologist testimony here, but I want to bring on our new guest, Lakai Vinson, defense attorney, who will be able to give some insight as to the testimony that we've heard so far. Lakai, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Brian. Thank you for having me.
No, always a pleasure. So as we're looking here, I'm hearing some good things on behalf of the defense attorney. It seems like this is a pretty knowledgeable witness. I would argue potentially a credible witness. How is this helping the defense and maybe hurting the prosecution?
Well, of course, the pathologist is trying to establish his credibility by connecting with the jury. That's what you always want to do whenever you're a witness and an expert in a case. And so that's what he's attempting to do when he's talking about the fact that he doesn't like fried chicken or he doesn't like white or dark meat. So it's not necessarily that this case isn't a serious case and this is not a serious issue that he's giving testimony about, but he's establishing credibility with the jurors. He's certainly helpful for the defense because he's saying that it's plausible that this came from CPR and from her performing the Heimlich, the parents performing the Heimlich. However, what comes into question as whether or not you can compare those other case reports with what is going on in these set of circumstances. For example, they talk about the fact that there is additional bruising outside of the bruising that was done to potentially relieve the child from choking. There are concerns about the other children that are in the house and their bruising that they also have. So there are some concerns that there is bruising beyond the lacerations or the bruises associated with relieving the child from choking. There are other children in the house that have also suffered, also have lacerations on their bodies. So the prosecution is doing a good job poking holes into the expert witness's testimony about whether or not this is indeed bruising and an incident that occurred and a death that occurred as it relates to relieving the child from choking from chicken.
I fully agree. And I guess the question that even myself as a defense attorney has, and I think that many jurors and maybe our viewers would ask the same question, but how many holes does an attorney, whether it be a prosecutor poking holes in the defense witness's testimony or a defense attorney poking holes in a prosecution witness's testimony, how many holes need to be poked to eventually get to one side's destination or the other?
Well, I think as it relates to the prosecution, it's much easier for them to poke a hole in the defense expert's case in the defense or the expert's case, which they're doing in this particular case. And so as long as they're creating that reasonable doubt in the jury's mind as it relates to the prosecution, I think that they're doing a good job. The prosecution, of course, they're the individuals that have to prove it by clear and convincing evidence. They have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And so the question is whether or not they're doing that. The defense is taking the extra step by putting this expert on, which they don't have to do. And so the question is whether or not this expert is giving enough testimony to create the doubt in the jury's mind that this came from blunt force trauma with the intent to hurt the child or harm the child, but was it done so that the child could be relieved from choking as it relates specifically to chicken.
It's going to be interesting to see, especially what happens on the summation when either lawyers are able to put the pieces together and see what the juror ends up coming with. So again, Lakai, we're continuing with the testimony of this pathologist, and I believe that it's, just as you said earlier, it's the prosecution attempting to poke holes but also solidify their theory of the case, because as you said, the defense has no burden. They didn't have to put on any witnesses. This is their attempt to try to push back and pull away what the prosecution has put forward. Do you see this prosecution making some sort of headway in the attempt to solidify their case?
Well, I think the prosecution is doing a good job with continuing to poke the holes in their defense and stating that this occurred as a result of CPR. The issue, again, is that this expert witness is confirming their side of the case and the testimony that they put forth that there were other injuries outside of those that would have resulted solely from CPR. They talk about the lacerations on the head. They talk about the pelvic area. So there are certain areas of the body that are unrelated that demonstrate that there may have been some history of abuse. So I think that's where this expert witness runs into its challenges. He also talks about the fact that there is some sort of injury to the liver that could be weeks old, months old. He can't say. So that's certainly going to be a challenge that he's going to have to overcome in moving forward with his testimony.
Yeah, and we're all anticipating that after the cross-examination of this witness by the prosecution, that there's going to be some sort of rehabilitation or some sort of redirect by the defense attorney. If this was your case, and I know we're kind of sitting in the backseat looking over this defense attorney's shoulder, so we don't have all the information, but if this is your case, what facts do you think would need to be driven home by the defense attorney on that redirect?
Well, I think that the redirect is going to have to focus on the fact that the injury that is discussed could have occurred as a result of CPR, which the child ultimately died from. I think they're also going to have to talk about the fact that the child may have had other scars and bruises on themselves, but the child's 2 years old. The child may not have been in their care 24 hours if the child's at daycare or anything like that. The child may play with their siblings. They're going to receive bruises and scarring as a result of anything else that could have occurred on a day-to-day basis. So sort of refocus on the fact that the reason that the child died was due to the necessity to resuscitate or to relieve the child from choking on this chicken bone.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see what they come up with, and also to remind our viewers, to show them, when we do redirect, the prosecution's allowed to then recross again, but they can only recross on the topics that you bring up. So you don't want to open the door too wide to try to solidify your case, but you still want to get in there and get out as best as you can. Now we're going to get in and get out on this case after this break. So here you have the pathologist being questioned about how long it takes for certain injuries to heal, obviously taking them in comparison to adults and other research materials that this doctor and obviously the prosecution understands. Lakai, when we're talking about treatises for expert witnesses, as this doctor has obviously been established as, how much of is this just the prosecution or any lawyer saying, hey, I understand what you're saying, but another doctor might say something a little different? How does that work out?
Well, that's significant because they're pointing to the fact that this may be their testimony, but there are other physicians that see it from a different perspective. And it goes back to what we said, poking holes in that defense. If they're capable of poking holes in that defense, then it may be enough where the jury believes beyond a reasonable doubt that the foster parents committed this crime. And so that is what this expert or what this prosecution is continuing to do with this expert. And so it will be interesting to see if it's enough by saying this may be your line of testimony, but look at these other case reports and look at these other instances where the same thing occurred and there was a question as to whether or not there was abuse and whether or not there's abuse in this particular case.
I totally agree. And we're going to continue with this testimony and the testimony of others after this break here, the Law and Crime Trial Network.